Poetics of Relation by Édouard Glissant, translated by Betsy Wing. Starting on page 185, that those beings be not being. Being is relation, but relation is safe from the idea of being. The idea of relation does not limit relation, nor does it fit outside of it. The idea of relation does not pre-exist relation. Someone who thinks relation thinks by means of it, just as someone who thinks he is safe from it. Relation contaminates, sweetens, as a principle or as flower dust. Relation enferrils, lying in wait for equivalents. That which would pre-exist relation is vacuity of being as being. Being as being is not opaque, but self-important. Relation struggles and states itself in opacity. It defers self-importance. Whatever claims to pre-exist, it is insufficient. That is self-importance for itself. Being as being is sufficiency for itself. For which reason is the echo of the idea of being. Relation does not assert being, except to distract. Also, when put forward in relation, every assertion is a limit. For relation neither deteriorates through nor obliterates any regression. Its patience outdistances depths and sea. Thus relation is idea of being, but scatters abroad from being as being and confronts presence. 2. Beings remain as long as being dissipates. Relation scatters from being, asserts the subject. To himself the subject is a thick cloud of knowledge. That is why relation also dismantles the thought of non-being. That is why it is not of being, but of beings. Non-being could not be except outside relation. Non-being does not precede relation, which is not expressed on the basis of any break. The non-being of relation would be its impossible completion. 3. Beings which subsist and present themselves are not merely substance, which would be sufficient unto itself. Beings risk the being of the world, or being earth. The being of the world realizes being, in beings. The being of the world cannot be divided from the being of the universe, and whatever imagines itself suspended in this whole, this suspension is not primarily spatial. The being of the world is total and limited. Its imagination varies, its knowledge flows. Relation is the knowledge in motion of beings, which risks the being of the world. Relation strives toward the being of the universe, through consent or violence. This effort is not primarily spatial. Never conceive of the being of the world or the being of the universe as being of being, or fitting themselves to it. It depends on relation that the knowledge and motion of the being of the universe be granted through osmosis, not through violence. Relation comprehends violence, marks its distance. It is passage, not primarily spatial, that passes itself off as passage and confronts the imaginary. 4. Opacity. Several years back, if I made the argument, "We demand the right to opacity," or argued in favor of this, whoever I was speaking to would explain indignantly, "Now it's back to barbarism. How can you communicate with what you don't understand?" But in 1989, and before very diverse audiences, when the same demand was formulated, it aroused new interest. Who knows? Maybe, in the meantime, the topicality of the question of differences, the right to difference, had been exhausted. The theory of difference is invaluable. It has allowed us to struggle against the reductive thought produced, in genetics for example, by the presumption of racial excellence or superiority. Albert Jacquard, Éloge de la différence et des sciences du sol, 1978, dismantled the mechanisms of this barbaric notion and demonstrated how ridiculous it was to claim a scientific basis for them. I call the reversal and exasperation of self barbaric, and just as inconceivable as the cruel result of these mechanisms. This theory has also made it possible to take in, perhaps not their existence, but at least the rightful entitlement to recognition of the minorities swarming throughout the world and the defense of their status. I call rightful the escape far from any legitimacy anchored silently or resolutely in possession and conquest. But difference itself can still contrive to reduce things to the transparent. If we examine the process of understanding people, and ideas from the perspective of Western thought, we discover that its basis is this requirement for transparency. In order to understand and thus accept you, I have to measure your solidity with the ideal scale, providing me with the grounds to make comparisons and, perhaps, judgments. I have to reduce. Accepting differences does, of course, upset the hierarchy of this scale. I understand your difference, or in other words, without creating a hierarchy, I relate it to my norm. I admit you to existence within my system. I create you afresh. But perhaps we need to bring an end to the very notion of a scale, displace all reduction. Agree not merely to the right to difference, but, carrying this further, agree also to the right to opacity, that is not enclosure within an impenetrable autarky, but subsistence within an irreducible singularity. Opacities can coexist and converge, weaving fabrics. To understand these truly, one must focus on the texture of the weave, and not on the nature of its components. For the time being, perhaps, give up this old obsession with discovering what lies at the bottom of natures. There would be something great and noble about initiating such a movement, referring not to humanity, but to the exultant divergence of humanities. Thought of self and thought of other here become obsolete in their duality. Every other is a citizen and no longer a barbarian. What is here is open as much as this there. I would be incapable of projecting from one to the other. This here is the weave, and it weaves no boundaries. The right to opacity would not establish autism. It would be the real foundation of relation, in freedoms. And now what they tell me is, you calmly pack your poetics into these craters of opacity, and claim to rise so serenely beyond the prodigiously elucidating work that the West has accomplished, but there you go, talking non-stop about this West. And what would you rather I talk about at this beginning, if not this transparency, whose aim was to reduce us? Because, if I don't begin there, you will see me consumed with the sullen jabber of childish refusal, convulsive and powerless. This is where I start. As for my identity, I'll take care of that myself. There has to be a dialogue with the West, which moreover is contradictory in itself. Usually this is the argument raised when I talk about cultures of the one. The complementary discourse of whoever wants to give on and with must be added to the West, and can you not see that we are implicated in its evolution? Merely consider the hypothesis of a Christian Europe, convinced of its legitimacy, rallied together in its reconstituted universality, having once again, therefore, transformed its forces into a universal value, triangulated with the technological strength of the United States and the financial sovereignty of Japan, and you will have some notion of the silence and indifference that for the next 50 years, if it is possible thus to estimate, surround the problems, the dependencies, and the chaotic sufferings of the countries of the South with nothingness. And also consider that the West itself has produced the variables to contradict its impressive trajectory every time. This is the way in which the West is not monolithic, and this is why it is surely necessary that it move toward entanglement. The real question is whether it will do so in a participatory manner, or if its entanglement will be based on old impositions. And even if we should have no illusions about the realities, their facts already begin to change simply by asking this question. The opaque is not the obscure, though it is possible for it to be so and be accepted as such. It is that which cannot be reduced, which is the most perennial guarantee of participation and confluence. We are far from the opacities of myth or tragedy, whose obscurity was accompanied by exclusion, and whose transparency aimed at grasping. In this version of understanding, the verb to grasp contains the movement of hands that grab their surroundings and bring them back to themselves, a gesture of enclosure, if not appropriation. Let our understanding prefer the gesture of giving on and with, that opens finally on totality. At this point I need to explain what I mean by this totality. I have made so much noise about it. It is the idea itself of totality, as expressed so superbly in Western thought, that is threatened with immobility. We have suggested that relation is an open totality evolving upon itself. That means that, thought of in this manner, it is the principle of unity that we subtract from this idea. In relation, the whole is not the finality of its parts, for multiplicity in totality is totally diversity. Let us say this again, opaquely. The idea of totality alone is an obstacle to totality. The idea of totality alone is an obstacle to totality. We have already articulated the poetic force. We see it as radiant, replacing the absorbing concept of unity. It is the opacity of the diverse animating the imagined transparency of relation. The imaginary does not bear with it the coercive requirements of idea. It prefigures reality without determining it a priori. The thought of opacity distracts me from absolute truths whose guardian I might believe myself to be. Far from cornering me with futility and inactivity by making me sensitive to the limits of every method, it relativizes every possibility of every action within me. Whether this consists of spreading overarching general ideas, or hanging on to the concrete, the law of facts, the precision of details, or sacrificing some apparently less important thing in the name of efficacy, the thought of opacity saves me from unequivocal courses and irreversible choices. As far as my identity is concerned, I will take care of it myself. That is, I shall not allow it to become cornered in any essence. I shall also pay attention to not mixing it into any amalgam. Amalgam? Rather, it does not disturb me to accept that there are places where my identity is obscure to me. Amalgam! I shall also pay attention to not mixing it into any amalgam. Rather, it does not disturb me to accept that there are places where my identity is obscure to me, and the fact that it amazes me does not mean I relinquish it. Human behaviors are fractal in nature. If we become conscious of this and give up trying to reduce such behaviors to the obviousness of a transparency, this will, perhaps, contribute to lightening their load, as every individual begins not grasping his own motivations, taking himself apart in this manner. The rule of action, what is called ethics, or else the ideal, or just logical relation, would gain ground, as an obvious fact, by not being mixed into the preconceived transparency of universal models. The rule of every action, individual or community, would gain ground by perfecting itself through the experience of relation. It is the network that expresses the ethics. Every moral doctrine is a utopia, but this morality would only become a utopia if relation itself had sunk into an absolute excessiveness of chaos. The wager is that chaos is order, and disorder excessiveness with no absolute, fate, and evolution. I thus am able to conceive of the opacity of the other for me, without reproach for my opacity for him. To feel in solidarity with him, or to build with him, or to like what he does, it is not necessary for me to grasp him. It is not necessary to try to become the other, to become other, nor to make him in my image. These projects of transmutation, without metempsychosis, have resulted from the worst pretensions and the greatest of magnanimities in the part of the West. They describe the fate of Victor Segolin. The death of Segolin is not just a physiological outcome. We recall his confiding, in the last days of his life, without the slovenliness of his body, whose illness he was unable to diagnose and whose decline he was unable to control. No doubt it will be known, with a list of symptoms and the help of medical progress, what he died of. And no doubt the people around him could say he died of some sort of generalized consumption. But I myself believe that he died of the opacity of the other, of coming face to face with the impossibility of accomplishing the transmutation that he had dreamed of. Like every European of his day, he was marked with a substantial, even if unconscious, dose of ethnocentrism, but he was also possessed, more than any of his contemporaries, by this absolute and incomplete generosity that drove him to realize himself elsewhere. He suffered from this accursed contradiction, unable to know that a transfer into transparency ran counter to his project, and that, on the contrary, respect for mutual forms of opacity would have accomplished it. He was heroically consumed in the impossibility of being other. Death is the outcome of the opacities, and this is why the idea of death never leaves us. On the other hand, if an opacity is the basis for a legitimacy, this would be the sign of its having entered into a political dimension, a formidable prospect, less dangerous perhaps than the erring ways to which so many centuries and so many clear, so-called lucid truths have led. The excesses of these political assurances would fortunately be contained by the sense not that everything is futile, but that there are limits to absolute truth. How can one point out these limits without lapsing into skepticism or paralysis? How can one reconcile the hard line inherent in any politics and the questioning essential to any relation? Only by understanding that it is impossible to reduce anyone, no matter who, to a truth he would not have generated on his own, that is, within the opacity of his time and place. Plato's city is for Plato, Hegel's vision is for Hegel, the griot's town is for the griot. Nothing prohibits our seeing them in confluence, without confusing them in some magma or reducing them to each other. This same opacity is also the force that drives every community, the thing that would bring us together forever and make us permanently distinctive. Widespread consent to specific opacities is the most straightforward equivalent of non-barbarism. We clamor for the right to opacity for everyone. Open circle lived relation. There is a point at which relation is no longer expressed through a procession of trajectories, itineraries, succeeding, seceding, or thwarting one another, but explodes by itself and within itself like a network, inscribed in the self-sufficient totality of the world. We leave behind the imaginary that projects with its daring inventions, its escapades, the unknown things it has risked, flaming arrows and unmerciful shots. The thrust of the world and its desire no longer embolden you onward in a fever of discovery. They multiply you all around. Having in the end, and despite all the impossibilities, drawn near relation and acknowledged our presentiments of how it works, now we must disindividuate it as a system, stretch it out to the mass that bursts forth just from its energy, finding ourselves there along with others. To disindividuate relation is to relate the theory to the lived experience of every form of humanity in its singularity. This means returning to the opacities which produce every exception, are propelled by every divergence, and live through becoming involved not with projects, but with the reflected density of existences. What we call the world today is not only the convergence of the histories of peoples that has swept away the claims of philosophies of history, but also the encounters in consciousness among these histories and materialities of the planet. Catastrophic fires reactivate the work of genocides. Famines and droughts take root in suicidal political regimes. Warring parties defoliate on a staggering scale. Floods and hurricanes call forth international solidarity, yet no one can prevent them or really combat their effects. Humanitarian movements have sprung up in wealthy nations that strive to bandage the open sores in poor countries, inflicted more often than not by the merciless economies of these same rich countries. Jungles and tribes are simultaneously torn up by the roots, and so it goes on endlessly. The shock wave set off in the European consciousness by the earthquake in Lisbon in the 18th century has spread far and wide. No specific history, joy or tragedy, extortion or liberation, is shut up solely in its own territory, nor solely in the logic of its collective thought. The woes of the landscape have invaded speech, rekindling the woes of humanities, in order to conceive of it. Can we bear ad infinitum this rambling on of knowledge? Can we get our minds off it? Here in the imaginary of totality, we are saved from eschiat, from reverted errantry. If, however, we mean to escape either vague rambling or the neutralizing tactics of suspension we ordinarily use to avoid it, we must not just imagine totality as we earlier suggested, nor simply approach relation through a displacement of thought. We must also involve this imaginary in the place we live, even if errantry is part of it. Neither action nor place are generalizable. What I said about antianite in this place where we, men and women of the Caribbean, rise up, represents quite simply the will to rally together and diffract the anta-islands, confirming us in ourselves and joining us to an elsewhere. For us, antianite, a method and not a state of being, can never be accomplished, nor can we go beyond it. But though we are thus entering modernity by confirming the work of our cultures, we cannot be aware that one of modernity's most persistent motifs is wholly embodied in the unconscious drive that wills deculturation. Because humanities sense that their cultures constitute the not prime elements of the generality of the chaos monde, they instinctively indulge in anti-cultural backlash, as if they wanted to preserve this generality from any normative effects that the culture's thought might have introduced. Moreover, it doesn't matter how we stigmatize one episode or another, for example, of the Chinese Revolution, when the entire apparatus of flash agents aim for the same anti-cultural elementarity. As if they meant to assert that cultures do not delineate pre-established harmonies, that the histories of peoples do not all work together toward a single genealogy. Modern violence is anti-cultural, which means it tries hard to guarantee the open energy of the shock between cultures. Is this a return of barbarism, or is it some prophetic precautionary measure against the barbarism of reductiveness and uniformity? One of the constants of this modern violence is that its duty is to be staged at all costs. Whether this modern violence is real or simulated, it demands to shine and cannot do without the services of flash agents. The underground violences in the ghettos or in the bush, the violences of obscure wars for survival, come unraveled when solutions appear. The black people in the United States, in the places where they are the poorest, because the means of existence are beyond them, and because they have no other solutions, exert a total violence in the city underground. The violence of destitute poverty is not, however, a mission, but modern violence, born of the shock among cultures, is of another sort. It feeds on its own dazzle and is exacerbated by its own feedback. Two of the television shows that struck me most in the United States, in a surprising parallel, present a mixture of belief intensified by its own spectacle, and by a willingness to believe, which is kept up by any approximations of spectacle. Wrestling matches are not really meant to determine which competitor is the strongest. In the audience, however, they stir up waves of irrepressible violence, stripped of any skepticism. This is not a matter of displaying only bestial violence, but, going much further, a pure, if one can call it that, violence, white as metal heated to the most intense incandescence. The audience believes in this violence, in its spectacle. It comes for that. It comes in families with children. It does not care that staging conceals the cheating. The desire for manifest violence is stronger than any suspicion of hidden nonviolence. The alarming costumes of the wrestlers, the incredibly heightened language that they engage in during the televised interviews, heralding their fights and serving to advertise them, the surge of pretend or real sadism on stage, all make it perfectly obvious that the rule here is to produce the severest shock possible. Theater is another spectacle that is just as astounding because of its suppressed violence. TV preaching. There is another spectacle that is just as astounding because of its suppressed violence. TV preaching. These preachers give a physical performance, making the most of the body's every posture. They imitate the extremely effective gestures of black actors. They weep, they sing, they play the piano, they turn the voltage as high as it will go and keep the physical and spiritual tension up relentlessly before resolving it into a blessed beatitude. Those present, and perhaps also the television viewers, all weep in unison, faint, and go into trances. That the preaching is staged does not bother anyone, nor do the scandals concerning the behavior and corrupt practices that have sullied a number of these dazzling ministers, these flash preachers. The desire for catharsis is stronger than any suspicion of insincerity. Asceticism through violence, in order to rediscover an original purity. You have to show that you abandon yourself to it, and that this works. This is not yet the violence of barbarism, but a desperate quest. Barbarism, tyrannical self-love, comes later. That is why such powerful personal generosities exist in this country. They are an endeavor to fend off the conclusions of this maelstrom. Although the social service laws are ridiculously inadequate here compared with the various European legislations in force, nowhere else in the world does a call for gifts and private contributions encounter such a response, frequently verging on naivete. The violence of deculturation is thus somehow domesticated, caught up in dailiness. Let us not stop with this commonplace. That a poetics cannot guarantee us a concrete means of action, but a poetics perhaps does allow us to understand better our action in the world. We consider, for instance, how a requirement for cultural responsibility, inseparable from political independence, is to be related to the prophylactic violence of forms of deculturation, put into relation. That is what one might call defolkloration. The reductions of folklore, the belief that only atavistic energies will provide an existence, lie in ambush for all cultures, whether or not they are technological. The awareness of modernity leads us away from this reductiveness, offering us the image of relations, similarities of situation or diverging directions between what is us and what is other. But we must also examine the need to be careful because every generalization gives birth to its own illusions. For example, though folklore debilitates, it just as powerfully creates rhizomes. One could say that modernity, when it puts us thus in a position to be relative without being lost, co-adjusts without confusing. What means do we have at our disposal to balance these requirements, which are not necessarily harmonic? First, the imaginary. It works in a spiral, from one circularity to the next. It encounters new space and does not transform them into either depths or conquests, nor is it confined to the binaries that have seemed to preoccupy me throughout this book: extension, filation, transparency, opacity. The imaginary becomes complete on the margins of every new linear projection. It creates a network and constitutes volume. Binarities only serve as conveniences for approaching its weave. The imaginary comments with a dirge, or it just giggles, usually approaching the chaos monde in all its turbulence. It is wary of this reserved dimension referred to as humor. Humor always presupposes some hidden reference, providing the humorist his superiority. Humor derives from a classical left, unspoken or, quite the opposite, put in question as in the black humor of the surrealists. But its corrosive power is perhaps dissipated in the turbulence of the chaos monde, in which classicisms do not occur. The Creole storyteller does not want to be a humorist. He is surprising in his talent, which should not be said to be innate, for relentlessly bringing together the most heterogeneous elements of reality. Pierre Reverdy describes the same thing operating in poetry. There is no hidden reference in it, but rather an uninterrupted process of revelation, of putting into relation. There ought to be some other words to define this bringing together when it astounds us and deflects us from convention. The preferred scene of the Poetics of Relation is plain song or a yell, in duration or in the instant, because this poetics is disgusted by the offhandedness assumed by any presumption of superiority. In truth, however, this preference does not hold. Baroque speech does not acknowledge any pre-established norm. It recognizes only the rigors of form, precisely because it is confronting excessiveness. Next, the approach to reality. Conceiving of the order and disorder of the chaos monde does not put you in a privileged position to oppose those who perpetuate their powers of perversion. And yet, if we tried to make a list here concerning loci of hardship and oppression, one of those lists sketched throughout this book about other subjects, this one would surely be the longest. In totality, powers reinforce their powers, and it is the weakness of aesthetic thought of the various specific poetics that they make believe when confronted by this other sort of maelstrom. Though the imaginary of totality may be of no use to anyone in organizing resistance, at least it is possible to think it would allow everyone some protection against the numerous bad habits that are the result of ideology's time-honored thoughts. How many revolutions, full of how many instances of going beyond, have not foundered in blind limitations, absurd principles, thus rejoining the things they struggled against? The poetic perception of the chaos monde leads us to sense a few of the lessons of these many disastrous attempts. As for me, and only for myself, that is, with no pretense of giving a lesson, I would sum up these lessons as follows. The control of an action is in its act. The full sense of an action is in its place. The future of an action is in relation. In Glissant, the word relation is capital R, relation. These three statements are not intended to constitute a law. They mean that, once totality has been conceived of, one could not claim to evoke it a priori in order to intercede in problems here and now, but that no solution that is acted upon could, however, ignore or underestimate this totality's activity, which is relation. Against those who deal out generalizing lessons, against ideology content with its own company, against petty local masters, against an intolerant nationalist seclusion, against those who erect borders, those obsessed with military power, those who are repositories of the collective consciousness, the mouthpieces. There is no naivete involved in thus relativizing the most particular actions thus within the concrete matter of relation. Habit cannot be snared at one fell swoop. We are just barely beginning to have some idea of this underground logic that is not imposed as predicates, but that subjects us collectively to our contradictions. Contradictions. The racist Boers of South Africa are in seclusion there. They stubbornly invoke the sacredness of root, though filiation is not exportable, and they are unable to consent to the approaches of relation. They have taken refuge in the rigidity of apartheid. Oppressed black people in this country are the bearers of going beyond. They could have merely withdrawn into the sacred, that is, territory. They have the ancestral right to it, which is, of course, why a point was made of assigning them reservations on this soil. But the terrible intensity of their struggle leads them, however imperceptibly or chaotically, to encounters with people of mixed blood, with Indians, with whites. It teaches them and inspires them with a sense of relation. Nelson Mandela is an écho monde. Wherever oppressors, in one form or another, impose themselves, those who are oppressed represent, through their very resistance, the guarantee of such a future, even if it is fragile and threatened. Oppressive powers know this very well and attempt to incite heroes, whether real or mythic, to symbolize their causes. Thus there appear pseudo-echoes monde, which Western opinion has apparently become expert at creating. Meaning well has nothing to do with it, but rather the demand for totality, that every form of oppression tries to reduce, and that every resistance contributes to increasing. Then words, no one's fiefdom, meet up with the materiality of the world. Relation is spoken. I was struck by the cover of a magazine, Paris Match, May 11, 1989, whose tactics are certainly those of a flash agent, on which I read the caption, Chernobyl, 12 villages to be evacuated, the wolves are returning, the pines are blue. What was the infinite detour taken by this nuclear catastrophe, whose worldwide repercussions were felt among the destitute as well as among the well-to-do, in savannah villages, probably, just as much as in skyscrapers, probably, and which consequently fed the most passively experienced of commonplaces in the planetary consciousness, that led it also to be condensed into what seemed to be an involuntary poem, through which it happened that the world could speak to us? The landscape forced its way through the dazzling barrier, fixing upon the superficial brilliance this terse scrap of utterance. The circle opens up once more, at the same time that it builds in volume. Thus at every moment relation becomes complete, but also is destroyed in its generality by exactly what we put into action in a particular time and place. Relation that is destroyed at every instant and in every circumstance by this particularity, spelling our opacities, through this singularity, becomes once again the experience of relation. Its death as generality is what creates the life it has to share. For if every group of humankind were to fully live in relation, they would divert the concept into the naturality that would have made it concrete. Relation exists in being realized, that is, in being completed in a common place. This movement allows giving on and with the dialectic among aesthetics. If the imaginary carries us from thinking about this world to thinking about the universe, we can conceive that aesthetics, by means of which we make our imaginary concrete, with the opposite intention, always brings us back from the infinities of the universe to the definable poetics of our world. This is the world from which all norms are eliminated, and also it is this world that serves as our inspiration to approach the reality of our time and our place. Thus we go to the open circle of our relayed aesthetics, our unflagging politics. We leave the matrix abyss and the immeasurable abyss for this other one in which we wander about without becoming lost.